guest today with us, Johan Redstrõm from Romania University. Just to give you a brief background about our guest. It's a professor in the Design Institute of the Romania University. Was a former rector of the same institute, and he works in interaction design. It was on behalf of IADE, thank you again for joining us. It is truly, I hope, a truly inspiring moment for everyone in the room. Thank you, and the stage is yours.
Thank you. So nice to be here. Can you hear me all? So late in the day, we hope to be inspiring. We'll see about that. I'm going to talk a bit about digital transformations in design. But before I do that, I'd just like to address the PhD students who got here, because this is all about this conference and all. So how many are you? Who's a PhD student here? Lovely. Now, I just wanted to comment on that. I mean, by now you begin to wonder, so why keep us so long in this program? Why make us suffer so much? And why make us work so hard writing a thesis that no one will read again? And I just want to comment on that, because this has to do with one of the most important learning outcomes of the higher educational system, in my view, which we rarely talk about. And that is what we may call the acquired taste of work in progress. And it takes a certain amount of effort to actually grasp what this is. Namely, that you struggle, work really hard, give it your best, only to in the end also accept that it's never going to be finished. And this is a crucial insight for adopting sort of natural critical attitude to what we're doing. To have this idea that we may like things as they are, but we don't take them for given. We never think that it has to remain like that, because we know that things are not finished. It's constantly work in progress. So I thought I'd try to honor that spirit a bit today, and instead of giving a polished talk like you would sometimes see professors do, and it's not necessarily because they've figured everything out, it's just that we have done it so many times that we begin to believe it's true what we're saying. So I'm going to instead talk about things that I haven't quite figured out. You will probably spot gaps in my argument, and we can talk about that later. But I just want to sort of share some thoughts, things that I've been thinking about since I got the invitation here. And the invitation was to come here and talk about transformations in the digital realm. And I think, Emilia, you wrote to me, the theme for this year is transformation, and we would love to hear you talk about challenges of the future present digital transformation of our lives. And of course, this is probably, most of us begin to understand now, one of the big challenges of our time, and not the least for design. Because so far we've been fairly occupied with the surface of these technologies. We're thinking about how we interact with them, how we make sense of them, how they come to sort of be immediately present in our lives. But it's beginning to dawn upon us that's probably something bigger in the making here. Something that transforms the way we think about things, that we relate to each other, the way we do and make stuff, and so on. So far, if we compare this to the Industrial Revolution that gave birth to design as we know it today, we've so far been staring at steam engines. And we're beginning to grasp that our economy is changing, our work life is changing, the way we relate to physical objects in our everyday life is changing. Obviously, I don't have answers to what's going to happen as these things come about. But what I thought I'd do is to put myself in relation to three themes that I selected, and reflect a bit about that and see what comes out. And then hopefully we can have a bit of a conversation about it. So this is just trying out a few perspectives, not focusing on the technology as such. Amelia mentioned that I have a background in interaction design and sort of experimental design work, but I'll actually not talk much about the details of interactions today, but just trying to step back a bit and think about the transformations of the way we think about design that this might bring. So the first one I picked, theme, I picked three, and it was politics. And not necessarily in the sense of party politics and all that scene, but rather in the sense of governance, how we relate to power, how we relate to each other. And I thought I would sort of try to take that perspective and see where it would get to me. We'll see. So if we look back to the early days of design, the Bauhaus is celebrating 100 years this year. And this is one of the books that formed sort of a foundation in their thinking. Kandinsky's point to line to plane. And this sort of idea that everything starts with the dots. And of course the idea is that that's when the pen meets the paper. The dot is the first thing you do as a designer. And let's explore this idea about the dot a bit, because it sits very deep in the way we think about things. The idea that the explorations we do have a starting point. And when we face something difficult, we need to ask, where do we begin? This has follow us throughout our history. So you might recognize this one, this Joseph Forrest's Futures Code. And it illustrates different future scenarios, one could say. What is possible, what is plausible, what is probable, and what is preferable. So it seems that it helped us a lot to think about these starting points and where to go from them. But the thing is, with the digital, it doesn't really have dimensions like this. And the question is, does that influence how we need to think about it? So we look at an example like Facebook, for instance. It's a fairly spread digital service. I mean, 2 billion people use it, and way more people know how to use it if they want to. So it's for connecting friends, sharing stuff, making people sort of take part in each other's lives. But Facebook is not just one thing. This might be the starting point for starting to use it yourself, but it has actually quite a few different faces. So if we're instead a business approaching this, our starting point looks very different. So here it becomes instead a tool for connecting with the people who will love your business, which is different from connecting to yourself. And that, sort of going a bit deeper into this, we realized that from one perspective was about sharing aspects of your everyday life with your friends, is from another perspective a matter of sort of aggregating very detailed information about actual and potential customers to support effective advertising, among other things. So for instance, here you can read things like, Facebook audience insights give you aggregated information about 2 groups of people. People connected to your page and people on Facebook. So you can create content that resonates and easily find more people like the ones in your current audience. And further that, see age in gender breakdown, education level, job titles, relationship status and more. Learn about people's interests and hobbies. Quite a different point of view. And speaking about these starting points, one of the things you can do when you aggregate information like this is to tell us what happens. So this is Facebook Journey Analytics, in which you can track and see how people start in one place and end up in another. And this is about sort of tracking people's behavior across platforms. So even if you start looking at something on your mobile phone, you might end up on your laptop later, and this is a way of tracking all of that. So overall, it's probably fair to say that Facebook has done more to redefine the way we think about privacy and what we share and what not than any philosopher has done in modern times. So this is an article from 2010, which is some time ago, in which it states that, is there a limit to how much we'll share? CEO Mark Zuckerberg is betting there isn't. And by now we're sort of beginning to realize that, yeah, he was right, but probably not in the sense he intended to. And it's also clear that exploring the limits of what people are willing to share along those lines has consequences. This is something familiar, I think. We've seen several instances where Facebook has been used for political purposes. I mean, targeting specific demographic groups identified through this aggregated information set with tailor ads to influence their opinions. And some of this, like what came out of the Cambridge Analytica, quite clearly illustrates that what the user thinks he or she is doing and what someone else is using that data for are not at all the same thing. Quite different intentions based on the same data. You might also have seen papers like this or articles like this. This is from earlier this winter when Casey Newton wrote a piece in The Verge about the secret lives of content moderators on Facebook. Well worth reading if you haven't seen it. So when we look at something like Facebook, or any other kind of platform, I mean, if you look at Google, if you look at Amazon, or whatever, what constantly emerges is that they're not just one thing. They're not you can't understand what they're doing based on one set of intentions, one perspective. I mean, it used to be also before that our physical things could be thought of in different ways, you could approach them in different ways and so on, but the thing itself remained rather stable, and we could think about that. But these are not at all stable. They present themselves differently depending on who's looking. And sometimes they ask for a login to make sure, sometimes they use some other way of identifying who's watching, and they adopt. So we all see different things depending on what the system thinks we want to see or some other purpose. Let me show you another example. So this is an autonomous vehicle, a self-driving truck. And they are about to be released on public roads. And so, of course, there's been a lot of discussion around the ethics around this. And what is quite obvious when you look into the discussion around that is that they all center on the basic intention of the truck, namely to be driving on a road. And so the questions that come up is, what happens if there's an accident? What happens if something comes in the way? And so on and so forth. So most of the use scenarios that we tend to discuss are centered on the basic intention we have with the truck, namely to have it driving, delivering goods. And it's very rare that we look at implications outside of this basic intention, towards other kinds of consequences. So let's do that. This is a map. It's from the NPR. And it's quite obvious when you look at things like this, there are many other issues in making self-driving trucks than just whether there will be an accident or not. So this map shows the most common job for each state in the US. And as you can see, a majority of them, the most common job is truck driver. So with the introduction of these vehicles, we are going to reduce the basis for one of the most common occupations. And no matter if we think that's a good or bad idea, we can at least make the reflection that it's going to change a lot of other things besides the ethics of accidents on the road. This is going to have repercussions on people's lives, it's going to have repercussions on the overall economy, and because that economy is largely driven by consumption. And the thing is that the digital is full of these transformations that happen outside our intentions. So here's another one. Same map, but from the late 80s, in 1988. The most common job, 1988, was secretary. In just a few years, it was completely gone, more or less. Why? In 1981, we got this. And a few years later, we got this. So, I mean, the list of examples you can pick up when something digital brings about transformation that we perhaps could anticipate, but that fell outside what we were intending to design for, is extensive. And, I mean, some people might have thought that, you know, when it came to traditional print media, that the digital would change it, that newspapers would become online as well, that there would be sort of digital libraries and so on. But very few saw that it would be a search engine called Google that came up with a different idea about advertising that would completely transform the economy of printed media. So if we go back to this futures converse, starting in a point, perhaps we should instead be looking at something like this. Because when we add all the disregarded perspectives to our picture, taking a longer view on what we're looking at, we might be looking at something quite different than we first thought. And rather than being an illustration of ever-expanding possibilities, we see an illustration of our own tunnel vision. And importantly, this is not an argument about inclusion. It's not about making, for instance, my own perspective ever bigger and bigger. Because you're still in a position. And as much as I enjoy you wanting to listen to me, it's also worth remembering that I'm also just another white man from the north of Europe. And there are very many other perspectives in the world that needs to be listened to as well. So this is not about inclusion, this is about the risk of occlusion. The fact that you put things in a way that prevents you from seeing what else is out there. Not listening to when others speak, not letting others speak for that matter. And generally staying within the frames of your own reference all the time. And nothing perhaps illustrates this more forcefully than the issue of sustainability. So no, everything does not start with a dot. Perhaps when we're alone in artistic work, it's just us and the canvas, then it's empty. But when we're doing design, we're always in context. There are always others there. There are implications of what we do because we're existing in a bigger picture. Then we do not start with a point. We start with a field. And I think that requires a different way of thinking. So that was the first reflection. Now I'm going to have a go at history. I mean, why not? So this is something that I talked about at the conference called Research Through Design earlier this spring. And I'm not going to do the same thing here, but there's an aspect of this that I want to bring up. And it has to do, again, with what kind of design, what kind of transformations the digital are doing to design in relation to transformations that happened before to design. So the idea that I'd like to explore here is that there seems to be something driving change in design. And this idea might or might not be true, but it offers some interesting perspectives when you apply it to history. And the idea here is that design deals with increasing complexity by rebalancing what is known and what is unknown within the design process. So I thought I'd explore that a bit, but first let me unpack what I mean. So, complexity. It's all over the design literature, and it's almost like a mythical force we do and do not quite understand, but we refer to it all the time. And it seems to be important to us. But just to have some idea of what it is and why it's increasing, we can make something really simple here. So, if we look at, on one hand, the complexity of the design outcome, and on the other hand, the design situation, you can read this. If we start with low complexity, we will work in few materials, few functions. And we will also working in a situation where much is known, with limited reach and so on. And if we look, and I'm going to try to illustrate why this is sort of, might make sense by telling you a bit of a story. But I'm going to compress those two in just one line. And I'm going to say that it's increasing over time. So why was this? Let's start from the beginning then. So before industrial design came about, I would argue, complexity was really low in comparison, relatively speaking. Few materials, few functions, known context. So this is from a marvelous book. It's called the International Encyclopedia of Scientific Tailor Principles for All Kinds and Styles of Garment Making. It's written by D.C. Christner in 1885. And this particular section deals with tailor finishings. And let me just read a sentence here. We have given the above because they represent standard methods, the principles of which will ever remain the same, and which cannot be affected by fashion, as they can be adjusted to every conceivable style. So this is a fascinating book. I mean, it's a rich collection of techniques and methods, some of which are still used. But it's also kind of interesting as another example of design research, because especially in how it tries to appear rather scientific. And also of curiosity, I mean, the use of multiple different fonts. I mean, we recognize that from working about it. So this wealth of known things about the craft will then be complemented by specific knowledge about the customers. So, I mean, if we take tailoring as kind of a good example there, because you have the patterns, you have the techniques, you have the methods, and what you lack is the measurement. And so you acquire that. You know the customer, you measure his or her body. Let's take another example just to make a point here. So in this time of craft, the social contract between the ones making and the ones using were quite personal, and it's often lasting over very long periods of time. So this is an image from Diderot's Encyclopedia from 1769, and it's depicting various actions involved in the making of wheat. In 1923, much later, but still largely about the same processes, George Sturt wrote an intriguing book called The Wheelwright's Shop. He made the following remark. We got curiously intimate with the peculiar needs of the neighborhood. In farm wagon or dung cart, barley roller, plough, water barrel, and whatnot, the dimensions we choose, the curves we followed, and almost every piece of timber was curved, were imposed upon us by the nature of the soil in this or that farm, the gradient of this or that hill, the temper of this or that customer, or his choice perhaps in horseflesh. So this is a situation where much is known, and what is not known is still within reach. You can look at it, you can check it, you can ask. And from the perspective of making, that means that the situation is fairly contained. So that's what I want to describe here, that you have fairly sloping, very low complexity. But as you can see, it's pointing upwards. But before we go into why, we're just going to add 2 lines here to sort of get that part that I was just saying into the picture. So let's add a green line for what is already known when we start the design process. Things that we can more or less take for granted. I mean, in the tailoring book, for instance, the principles that must forever be known there because they're adaptable to every conceivable stuff. And then we have a red line for what we do not know, the things we need to find out, such as the measurement of the body. So what happened? This rather stable world started to change. There were new forces at work, steam engines, power machines, doing the work that people used to do by hand. Came to some areas before others, textiles was among the first. But over time, one area of making everyday things after another came to be affected by this industrialization. And the societal implications were enormous, of course, fundamentally changing the way we were making. So we don't have to go into the details of the complexity of the situation to appreciate that it was increasing and that there were a number of issues that came about that the craft at the time didn't respond well to. I mean, if you remember design history, I mean, the early, most of what was done in the early industrialization was simply reproduction of things that were used to be done by hand. So there's an enormous amount of machine-made ornamentation, for instance. So there was a number of issues that were surfacing where existing practice didn't have an effective answer. And so the question becomes then, will the incremental development be enough to cope with this change? Will it be enough to keep calm and carry on? I think they thought it would. But after a couple of decades of heavy industrialization, accelerating through different areas of life, it was increasingly clear, no, it was not going to be enough to keep calm and carry on. It is not enough to keep doing what we're doing. We have to do something new. We have to do something different. And this is when industrial design comes about, as something different from craft. But realizing that something needs to be done is not quite the same as knowing what to do. So here comes the part with the idea that I proposed. That one of the most important ways to cope with this complexity that came about at this time was the idea to rethink the design process as, or not the design process, the process of making, rather, as production, to making the process of making into a process of finding things out. I'm going to try to explain that. So, the first major transformation here was that making and production was separated. Making withdrew from production. Production was made by machines, not by hand anymore. And so instead, the making, and then what we now call design, became about doing the prototypes, the things that come before industrial production. So if I pick up on the Bauhaus thread there from before, it's found that Walter Gropius said it like this in 1926. The Bauhaus represents the opinion that the contrast between industry and the crafts is much less marked by the difference in the tools they use than by the division of labor in industry and the unity of the work and the crafts. But the two are constantly getting closer to each other. The crafts of the past have changed, and future crafts will be merged in a new productive unity in which they will carry out the experimental work for industrial production. Speculative experiments in laboratory workshops will yield models and prototypes for productive implementation in factories. So this withdrawal from production opened up the possibility that making will instead be oriented towards finding things out, by making prototyping distinct from reproducing. This changed a fundamental aspect of making, from being about producing the things we need directly, to instead opening up for making the knowledge that we need to produce that. So design becomes inherently about producing knowledge, not just making things. And it's there from the very beginning. So just to comment on that, this is the sort of rebalancing of what is known and unknown here, is that the withdrawal from actual production and yet making prototypes. You would make different prototypes to find out, therefore addressing what you didn't know. So what is taken for granted is decreasing, and what you're using design to find out is increasing. The next major transformation is really when design discovers that we can work with methods and methodology in the same way. This happened slightly later, probably in the 50s, 60s, I would say. So complexity was growing, and design had to deal with ever more complex products. We have electronics coming in, systems, and it was increasingly obvious that individual practice was not enough. You couldn't draw the design solution on a paper anymore. You needed multiple expertise, you needed collaborative efforts, and you needed sort of multidisciplinary teams. But to have that, you need to rethink how we make, how we design. Because you can't just have your own practice as a default. People do different things, have different expertise, different practices. But design discovered methods. Some of them scientific, some of them not so. And initially, I think much of the conversation around methods was about making design more scientific. I mean, that was an idea. But we kind of let that go fairly quickly and realized that, no, methods is just a way of designing the way we design, creating the structures we use for making. And we can make that something we design, not just have as a toolbox ready that we apply. We can make them. So this happened in places like the Hochschule für Gestaltung in Ulm. It happens with the formation of the Design Research Society in the 60s. Well, not the society in the 60s, but the design methods movement in the 60s. And so methods had been around for a really long time, and so that was not really new. But what was new was that we thought about methods as something we could design, something we could make. And so from having a focus on the outcomes of making, we now shift our attention towards the processes of designing and turning that into something we can actually make as well. So this was a transformation of how we make. When we open up collaboration and participation and realize that it's not going to be an individual effort, of course this question of who's making becomes more or less problematic. We need to deal with it. Who's the designer? Who's involved in the design? How is that, does that involvement look like? And obviously, not very long after the design movements in the 60s, we get the huge interest in participation. we get the first examples of participatory design. Co-design emerges slightly later. And I'm going to read a bit quote here from John Chris Jones, who was one of the initiators of the design methods movement. And this is from the preface to the second edition of his book, Design Methods, from 1980. Looking back now at this book and what has become of design methods, I think this is the crux of the matter. The new methods permit collaborative designing, whereas the other old methods do not. They change the nature of designing, or can if one lets them. The essential point is that the new methods permit collaboration before the concept, the organizing idea, the back of the envelope sketch, the design has emerged, providing that the leading designer knows how to switch from being the person responsible for the result to being the one who ensures that the process is right. The new methods, properly used, release everyone from the tyranny of imposed ideas and enable each to contribute to and act upon to the best that everyone is capable of imagining and doing. This is not easy. It requires not only new methods, but a new conception of the self. So here we have the third transformation in my little historical overview here, and the opening up of who's designing. So we've come a long way now from the individual craft that made the things that people directly wore or used, to making prototypes, drawing from production, to focusing not just on the outcomes of making, but the way we make, the methods. And now we're here at who's making, who is involved in the process, which roles do we play, how we relate to each other. So all these transformations, gradually opening up different aspects of practice that used to be sort of locked or taken for granted, we've become better and better dealing with complexity. We've been able to take on more and more difficult things in design. And we've become better and better finding out things through making. So in a sense, there's a history here of design not just coping more with increasing complexity, but also becoming increasingly research dependent. Research not in the sense of academic, scientific research, but research in the sense of finding things out, systematically working with creating the knowledge that is needed to do design well. So what was once design research is now part of what design professionals do on an everyday basis. What Walter Gropius talks about as systematic research into various areas and speculative experiments is just design these days. And this is not to say that everything that we do in research now will be part of practice later on, but rather say that history, I think, leaves us with a rather clear message about the contemporary task of design research, namely to open up and explore making in ways that we haven't done before. This is not just about maintaining practice, gradually sort of making it take one step more, but critiquing it, transforming it, opening it up in ways that we haven't done before. Because this increase in complexity is not going to stop. So here we come to the part where the digital enters the picture. You with me so far?
Mm-hmm.
As I said in the beginning, I may or may not be right about this, but the question is, what do we get to see if we look at it this way? So what things are there that we can open up? And I think the digital is going to ask of us to open up something we haven't really wanted to be in direct contact with for a very long time. We can call it theory, we can call it philosophy, we can just call it the conceptual, the way we think, the way we organize the space in which we solve our problems, figure out our versions of alternative futures and what have you. There are many things, when we look at back history, that have changed, allegedly. I mean, there's not much that's completely left untouched throughout. We can no longer take for granted why we design, because we approach it in so many different ways. I mean, it's not just for making things, but making all sorts of things. Who is involved in the process is definitely an open question, and how we go about it is perhaps even more so. But there are certain things that are also remarkably stable. Namely, what we design. This is, I mean, if you look at the educational system and the categories we filter things into, but also, I mean, the examples that I'm giving. I mean, for instance, the transformation of how clothes are made are substantial. But we still talk about clothes. We still talk about tools, things, houses, and so on. So let me illustrate part of this problem, or issue, of depending on existing categories when designing. And that being an indication that we haven't quite opened up the way we think. So design seems to be thriving within categories. We constantly come up with new variations. We've been making chairs for a very, very long time, and yet there seems to be an endless series of more chairs to be done, more variations to explore. And this goes for almost all different kinds of design we come up with. I mean, we have industrial design, textile design, user-centered design, participatory design, sustainable design, so on and so forth. I mean, we'd like to add things to given categories. And this is, I mean, even if you look at sort of work where you try to conceptually redefine how you go about designing, where you go to do your work, so to say, you can see that we often explain what we do by articulating the difference to something that's existing within. So for instance, we could say, I mean, we do service design, it differs from interaction design because it, or we do co-design, it differs from traditional user design in that, and so on. It's still design, only different. And this orientation towards differences, I mean, quite literally actually, how we work to make a difference, is very powerful. It's very effective, but it also has some side effects. Because even as we progress into new domains, we have a massive technological development, it seems we try our best to make them fit within categories we already work with. So for instance, we find it rather amusing that cars were first called horseless carriages. But they were horseless carriages. They were carriages just without horses. Same, but different. But really, are we that different? We have wireless networks. Networks, just different. And when an entirely new kind of thing enters the realm of human life, I mean, the best way we could come up with to make it understandable to us was to make it look like this, or actually, this was slightly earlier, this is the Xerox Star before the Apple Macintosh. It is like a disk, only different. That was in the early 80s, right? This machine is pretty much the same, only different. And we enter all sorts of issues when we do this. I mean, you might remember, picking up on our Facebook example from before, this was a huge debate. Is Facebook a media company or is it a tech company? Because different legislations apply. The fact that it would be neither didn't occur to us, really. That there is a new legal space that we need. No. It needs to fit an existing category. The question is, which one should it be? So I think we have work to do here. I think the complexity now that we're facing right now, again, asks us to open up something that's been fairly stable up until this point. And I think it's going to be the conceptual this time. That we actually really have to rethink the categories, the concepts, and all that. And I mean, of course, we already do this. I mean, there's conceptual design, and we articulate ourselves, and we define our ideas, and what have you, all the time. But we haven't done to the way we think what we have done before, to the way we make, to the way we involve others, and so on. We haven't opened up in that sense. We haven't opened up to structure the way we think, the way we structure the actively design methods, for instance. And I would like to say this is the opposite of design thinking, which is, to me, often taking the way we think in design and exporting it to some other domain to make use of that kind of structured thinking. This is the opposite. This is about making ways to think in design. So to conclude the second reflection, I think one of the things that digital transformation will do to design is that it's going to make our categories break down. Not necessarily immediately, but I think over time we'll realize that keeping things within the conceptual frameworks we've come to use in the days that came before, the things that we used to live with, will not do. I don't think we'll be able to solve the problems that we are facing doing that. But I do think that if we open up the conceptual in that creative, fantastic, explorative way that we've opened up these other aspects of making before, I think we could do really interesting things. It's going to be difficult, it's going to be sort of a jump into the dark, but that's always been the case. It was always difficult to make this transformation. What was done when sort of design became the making, speculative making of prototypes for industrial production was a huge step from being in control of the entire process as a craftsman. Involving others, not trained as designers in design, was also a great transformation that we were not particularly easy with in the beginning. But all of these things helped us immensely to do design in new ways, expanding the possibilities really. So that was my second reflection. Just one more. You're awake still?
Yeah.
Lovely. So the final one, I thought a bit more personal, and I'm not sure if I originally meant that would be personal for me or just personal in general, but I think it's a bit of both. I did my thesis in my own PhD thesis back in 2001. It was called Designing Everyday Computational Things. It relates a lot to this, about the shift from using things to living with things, computational things. And in that there's a core of aesthetics, of rethinking what aesthetics is. So that's a personal thing. And I'm actually going to talk about aesthetics here because I'm increasingly concerned that my rethink of aesthetics at the time was, well, it was helpful, but it was also completely insufficient. So I want to go back to this aesthetics thing. And it's also personal for a lot of designers because aesthetics is like, well, if there's anything personal in the design process that you have more difficulties handing over than anything else, is probably this. But so the issue that I want to bring up here is that if we look at the sort of aesthetical problem when design comes about and the distinction between the unity of the craft, where you have sort of, you're making the thing yourself and you sort of have the entire control, to something like this. This is a Ford assembly line from 1913. If we think that the responsibility of design is to craft the sort of meaningful whole, what was referred to in Gropius' quote there as the unity of the work. But this is a huge challenge, because no longer will the thing come together as a whole simply because it's one and the same person making it. Therefore, sort of making sure that it's consistent in some ways. This is, I mean, it's called an assembly line for a reason, right? You have multiple people taking parts made in different places, putting them together. And so it's not so surprising that the sort of one of the primary problems they had is how do you make this come together as a seamless unity? Something where you don't see the different pieces, but where you experience something that may not be the same as craft object, but it has the similar quality of being a meaningful whole. So this is from Max Billing. He was first a student at the Bauhaus and then later part of the team that started the school in Ulm. And he said in 53, his chart is more on my screen here, the basis of all production should be to fulfill, as a unity, the totality of all functions, including the aesthetic functions of an object. And if you want sort of more recent rediscovery or rearticulation of the same idea, we can pick something like this from Don Orman a couple of years ago. No product is an island. A product is more than the product. It's a cohesive, integrated set of experiences. Think through all of the stages of a product or service, from initial intentions to final reflections, from first usage to health service, and maintenance. Make them all work together seamlessly. Still the basic problem with the assembly line. How do we make all the things come together in something that's more than the pieces? We've become super good at this. Really, really good. So we've taken this example, for instance, the desktop computer, the graphical user interface. We're so good at making things come together as a seamless unity, oriented towards what we want to do with it, that what we actually do and see and interact with has basically nothing to do with how the thing actually works. So, I mean, what we do when we use a computer is really just one out of many different ways this could come to expression, given what the machine actually does. So in the case of a computer like this, unless you go into specific software, which takes quite specific knowledge, you have no idea what it's doing. It does a lot of things. Some of them are initiated by you, like it will jump to the next slide without a press, but it also does a lot of other things. And in the case of network machines, you don't even know where it's doing. It might be building on our resources something completely different. You don't even know which country it might be. And if I pick up on then first reflection idea, that there seem to be, that these things are not just one thing. You can see what they're doing from multiple different perspectives. It's quite clear that it's not really just about me using this thing anymore. It's rather living with something. We do have our smartphones around. I mean, of course we could say, I use it to check email, but it's also something that's there with us. We live with it. And this sort of seamless unity, this sort of effortless interaction, this sort of immediate confirmation of, yes, I will do what you say you want to do. I won't talk about the other things I do, like in the Facebook example, but you know it's something. So somehow I think we're shifting from using tools to living with things, and this calls a different set of questions into play. Namely, it's not just about me and my intention, it's about relationships. Now, fortunately, there's a wealth of knowledge out there regarding relationships with things we do not quite understand. So for instance, we can turn to this. All sorts of quizzes you can do to understand more about the relationship. But actually, I'm going to pick one that's slightly more serious, perhaps, than this. This is from a site I found, loveisrespect.org. It's about discovering if you are in an unhealthy relationship and what to do about it, to find support if you need so to get away from abuse, for instance. There's a quiz you can take it. About 28, 30 questions, something like that, in order to get a sense of whether you are in a healthy relationship or not. I thought we could take one with respect to our relationship to our phones. So I picked a few, rephrased them slightly, but not actually, no, I haven't rephrased them. The only thing I've done is that I replaced person with technology. So answer for yourself here. The technology that I'm with understands that I'll have my own life too. Yes or no? Mm-hmm. The technology that I'm with texts me or calls me all the time. Yes or no? The technology that I'm with constantly checks up on me or makes me check in. The technology that I'm with tries to control what I do and who I see. The technology that I'm with tries to keep me from seeing or talking to my family or friends. Well. The thing is, if you look at the scores here, can you read it? Yeah. Then I'm not going to read it all. But if you scored only 2 here, you might be noticing a couple of things in your relationship that are unhealthy, but it's still a good idea to keep an eye out and make sure that So it isn't an unhealthy pattern development. But down here on score 5, which some of you seem to be indicating, you are definitely seeing warning signs and maybe an abusive relationship. Remember that the most important thing is your safety. Consider making a safety plan. You don't have to deal with this alone. Love and respect can help. Chat us with us to learn more about your different options. So no, these new things are not the same as the things we used to live with. They're different. And so perhaps we shouldn't try so hard making them appear as if they are. And this is where I think I have some future work to do. I'm thinking around issues of aesthetics and immanence, but just like the PhD thesis, when it gets interesting, time is running out. So that will be for another time. But let me just wrap up here. Are there any conclusions to draw from this? I think it's to me, if I look back at the origins of industrial design, and so one of the key issues seemed to be to find new foundations. They were still making same or similar kinds of things, but to do so in a very different context. Instead of making it through craft, you would be making it through machine production. And to search for such foundations, it was more or less necessary also to ask very basic questions. So it's not surprising that places like the Bauhaus and so on would do the kind of work that Kandinsky, the Albers and others were doing. Asking, what is a point? What is a line? What is a plane? What is color? And so on and so forth. What is form? The fascination with basic form. And so with this very visual orientation around form, the dot is indeed the first thing you start with. It touches the paper, the sort of foundation in that sense. But I think our issues now are different from this. We don't do the same things, but differently. We do different things, but try to do them the same. It's like the opposite problem. And so rather than just using things, we've come to live with them, and we're forming relationships that are dynamic, not just on our side, like they always have been, but on their side as well. They change, adopt, become something depending on what we do with them. So I like to replace this idea about everything starts with a dot. And Fireflies can instead say everything starts with connecting the dots. It doesn't start with a point anymore. It starts in the field. And it is in the relationships and in grasping the complexity that sits and connecting the dots. That's our challenge. And I think this is also perhaps our best chance of avoiding the kind of tunnel vision that also design largely suffers from because of our fixation around our own intentions. And with that, I'd like to thank you for listening.
Thank you for this inspiring talk. Now we have time for Q&A. So the microphone is going to you. Please get the leads to help us. Thank you.
I do have a question. So you were, well, in one of your thoughts and considering what may be the role of design or the design practice, you talked about conceptual. So I would like to explore that and understand, do you think that, I mean, what will be the role of design in different organizations? Do you think it will be more relevant? And if so, which role, which kind of role would designers have in that scenario?
The role might be pretty much the one that we already have. I mean, to figure out what is meaningful and how to achieve it. I only think that the way to do so might be quite different from the way we do it now. I mean, back in the early days of industrial design, to fill that function, I mean, to figure out what's meaningful to produce and how to do it, was a question of making the prototype that would then be machine made. But with step, until the 80s, it would come up with, okay, so what is a meaningful way of manifesting the functionality of this complex machine so that people can use it? And so design changed to deal with that. And so I think it has to do with basically performing the same kind of role, but in relation to a different kind of question. And I think in the case of some of these new technologies, they really suffer from understanding of what are they? What should they become? How should I relate to them? What am I willing to give away in terms of a relationship? I mean, in a human relationship, you have, if not protocol, but at least there are certain things you can talk about when you meet the person the first time. There are certain things you don't ask after you get to know someone. And if you're in a relationship, and you have a partner, there are certainly stages you go through when you can and cannot do certain things, what kind of exchange. But somehow these devices circumscribe all of that and go directly to asking questions that you would never really, relationship status, hobbies, interests. When do you actually pop that question to someone you just meet? So I mean, there are a lot of things that has to do with coming up with the ways that we will live with these things that I think design has to do. And it's not just going to be about what should they look like, should it be blue or green, what is the interaction model? Something maybe way more subtle than that. Ethics come into it, but it's always part of it. Okay, thank you.
Hello. First of all, thank you very much. It was really inspiring.
Thank you.
I must assure you about that. Which side are you? From which side are you in the sense that you're ending? And I think I totally agree with you, with not really with the historical perspective, and we can talk about that a few moments later. But the thing is that these things are really menacing us if they don't look differently. So the problem is that they are not dangerous, but they are in fact dangerous because we are transferring more and more our intelligence, or our being, more than our intelligence, our being in the world. So I would like to ask you about your last slide. What do you consider as an aesthetic of immanence, and how can you apply and more or less contribute to save us from this kind of new horde of barbarians that are our own creation? Can you tell us more about what you see?
No, I mean, it's then you're in for a long answer. But the short one, if I was to get to the bottom line, I think that the aesthetics that we currently primarily orient towards in design has to do with this idea of crafting the totality, of everything coming together as a seamless unity. I think that idea has to go. I think we need to do something, and this hence the immanence part. We need to reconsider the idea that it should be seamless, that it should be something we really don't have any distance to, and where it's also more obvious that we're part of it. We're not using it, but really part of it. And how to craft those expressions, I think simply calls for experimental work, like it's always been. I mean, we need to go to work and try these things out, build them. This is evolving new design practice, trying these things out.
I want to thank you. I really have lots of fun, really. I like the way you shift and you cross so many different perspectives. It was really brilliant. And it gets to me this final thought, that I'll take it with me, that, from tools, you came from this, that with tools we make the pieces and the artifacts, And then we leave, we shift from doing to living with these things, and now from being these things, from cohabiting, co-living with these objects, in the sense that these objects also have an intelligence. They will help us, like the GPS. We can no longer live without the GPS, but somehow we rely too much and we abdicated. I don't know if abdicated is the best word. Abdicare.
I think it works.
Yeah, abdicated.
Yeah, absolutely.
It works with royalty, so it's...
Yeah, but I get the sort of original.
So you see, we kind of like we give our data to Facebook. We give so much, but also we give from our decisions and from so much. So this idea of these objects that co-live with us, it's an amazing thought, actually. I really like it. Thank you very much for bringing all this.
Thank you. But and also on that note, I mean, if we look at something like machine learning and artificial intelligence, I mean, one of the problems that you have to deal with if you're doing a system like that, it needs data for training. And so the question is, where does the data come from? And I mean, if we're interested in change, as we are in design, and you rely on training things on things that happened before, where does that lead you? I mean, for instance, if you have a machine that learns to live with you based on what you have done the past 10 years, and you intend to do a change in your life,
You will not understand it.
I mean, it's not going to support it very well based on the data it's already have. So there's an enormous implications around the technologies that we're building right now that has, I mean, if we're not careful, they will have a conserving effect on a lot of things. And there's a lot of ethics around this that are not particularly, I mean, it's, I mean, the sort of what you give away and sort of acting, and as an example of the car, self-driving truck, for instance, that it shouldn't cause accidents and so on. But there's a whole range of other questions around this that are not particularly just in the thing, but in the effects that it has in the bigger picture that I found missing in design largely.
Very, very. Wow.
Hello. Thank you for your presentation. My question is, in your vision, what do you think will be the role of the universities and education in forming this design for the future and this vision from this kind of material thinking, way of thinking, to this more intellectual breakdown of our concepts that we have today?
I think that's an excellent question. And I think I'm not sure I have a very innovative answer to that question, because I think basically this relationship remains largely what it has been for a very, very long time, namely that we use academia to prepare ourselves, to gather the knowledge we think we need to do whatever we're going to do, and to fill in the gaps when we find them. It's a place for experimentation, where we can try things out, hopefully without causing too much damage. I mean, that's what you do when you're in a learning situation. When you try a lot of things, you can fail many times, and that's the whole point. And I think we should use academia to fail more, to try out ideas that industry won't try, or that they might say that they can afford it or don't want to, but it's also because it's outside the immediate scope and was profitable, for instance. I think there's a need for experimentation. I truly believe that the sort of the practice-based idea about both education and knowledge that design sort of has in its very roots is going to be super important. Because there are so many things here we just simply cannot calculate or predict, but just simply have to experiment with and find out. And the reason I wanted to show that first reflection with the sort of, not the ever-expanding futures cone, but also the other one, is also to say that we need more alternative views on this. And so I have one, you might have still another, and it's by lining all these up that we actually get the big picture. So it's not about finding one vision for how to do this, it's exploring many and seeing where they lead to. And I think that's the other part of this narrative, is that much of the story around technological development and where we're heading from, it's really a monoculture. There are a few big stories that are repeated over and over and over, and we need more of them. We need alternative views, many of them. So there, I think academia and education plays a role, providing those alternatives and practicing them, seeing what they lead to. Yeah.
Hello. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your very inspiring talk. I work in multimedia and the user-centered design and interface. Myself? Okay. And when I teach like the history of multimedia even, there were some common things here that for example, the seamless thing that you mentioned in the cinema, at some point, film editing, it was about seamless editing, and then it became something different with the Russian filmmakers and then many more approaches. And I found it very interesting how this is, in a way, a similar process. When you discover a new medium, then first you try to dominate the medium, then you imitate what you already knew, and then you have to create a new way to think about it and new rules. And I found it quite interesting that you are in a way talking about things that match this idea. So I have a question for you. How do you see, for example, the science fiction, and talking about movements, science fiction, for example, as a source of ideas or ways about how to go about these new challenges we are facing in reality, that somehow people that wrote about future already reviewed to some extent. What do you think about that?
No, I completely agree, and I think the whole area of fiction is really taking off in design. The area of design fiction has gone from being a fairly sort of marginal phenomenon to being really prominent in just 5-10 years or so. So I think that the exploration of design fictions, closely related to science fictions, is absolutely being picked up as a way of working, a way of proposing things and trying things out. So absolutely.
In the movies, we already saw these potential futures where technology is going to take over. So.
Mm. It's sometimes, it's in a sense what you do when you do a prototype and put it out in the world is a kind of tangible fiction. You see, okay, so we've designed this prototype, now we're going to see how it works. Sometimes it's not super speculative because it might be fairly close to, it doesn't challenge your worldview so much, but it could. We could be making speculative prototypes, ask people to live with them, that were more provocative, that were more speculative. It's just a question of what makes sense to do and what are people willing to try. But definitely I put some speculative works in people's lives times.
It's hard because we humans have differences and we can change and can be unexpectable and something that the computer cannot expect, So this is very much the difference that will never take. This is a reality that will never happen. Computers can never be coexist with our when we decide to be creative, unexpectable or unexpected. So it's something that's surreal and a fiction that probably will never match reality.
Well, it might be right, but it might also be that expectation is wrong. Because what computers are able to do continuously pushing what we thought they could. And the kinds of patterns that emerge when you have massive amounts of data and you put them to use, it's, people are not completely predictable, but the fact that we've come this far already suggests that we might not, we should be a bit careful, I think, to say they won't be able to do that. We don't know. That's one of the things I think we should ask. They will not do it like we do it, but it might be something else.
But we might adapt to it.
We already do, right?
Yeah.
I was going to make a question regarding I was thinking about the problem of induction regarding past experiences. The Turkey problem, right? Turkey gets fed each and every day, and eventually he gets recognized, that person who gives him food as something good. Eventually that person comes and does one thing that is not good for the turkey. So a lot of the discourse that is going around technology and it relates to this is that it's so much data, we're going to be able to know a lot of stuff. But past experiences do not tell us unless it's a sufficiently long amount of data to help us to see the future. So I was wondering if you could tell us something about the hubris and how can this failing, learning how to fail, or prototyping, can help us avoid this kind of thing. Imagining that technology with data is going to solve each and every one of our problems in the future because we can predict stuff. And my question is, can design help us prototype by assuming that we don't know the necessary outcome of it to overcome these problems, to put a check on what to do?
That's a truly difficult question. And I think one of the ones that we need to ask ourselves, because we're shifting from a model where we make the design decision, this is the way it will be, to having a more probabilistic model, where we're defining a field of options and the likelihood for what might occur. But I think before we get there, we also need to remember the sort of question before that, namely, not so much whether the technology can get it right or not, but whether what makes sense to have the technology have a say in based on how predictable it is. Because the problem right now is that there's a lot of things being done on basis of those predictions, whether they are wrong or right. I mean, all sorts of filtering mechanisms, for instance, whether do we actually get to see the right results when we search is a trivial thing. Does a hiring agency get to see the candidates they should when they do a search? I mean, there are all sorts of things that we already do based on prediction that may or may not be true. And it's not so much, the question is not only whether how should we improve the likelihood of that being right, but rather should we be dependent on predictions in that way at all? And I think that question is the first design question we need to ask. How do you build a system that, or service, that exposes this issue of prediction and let you handle it? So it's not just, I mean, how do you filter it? How do you sort of influence? Is there any kind of governance or insight into this?
How do you show this, the weakness of the system?
Or it's behaviors. I mean, in a sense, it's mindset where it's worldview, because that might be completely wrong.
Yeah, so like what you said about the controlling, so the thought arises from that thought itself when you say that like to build a system which can predict, which can allow you to see what are going to be the future predictions. So that thought itself controls and it emerges into a technology which further you will feel as like that's something insecure for yourself. So the thought of like controlling something itself is leading to the wrong conclusions for the future. So that's what I see in the last conversation what you had. And so it's like the things are going on and it's something beyond, it has reached like, because every technology, every innovation is important also for humans, because that leads us to certain things which we were not even able to think of. And we have reached to a place now. And everything starts with the dot, but it connects to other dots too. So that's something like my conclusion towards what the discussion was. And I think that question, I just wanted to discuss on that.
That's the problem of being so inspired. That inspired.
But this is the fun part, right?
The thing that occurred to me is that in the beginning of digitalization is the same beginning of the dot, is signal, no signal. So in the beginning it's signal. It's a sort of metaphor for the dot, or the dot is the metaphor for the signal. And there is a lot more in Kandinsky and all those guys. It's the way you articulate a Euclidean vision of the world. In Euclid, we live in the Euclidean vision of the world, and we are changing because the world in which we really live in is not Euclidean with surfaces and volumes and etc. That's how inspiring you were. I like very much a quote from Susan Sontag that she says, space exists because we don't want everything on top of everything, and time exists because we don't want everything on top of everything at the same time. So that's what I think is that there should be a resistance of the Euclidean system by which we exist in the world. Just let me tell you a story, if I make sense. We have at my home, my wife operates one of those machines, cooking machines, Vorwerk machines, and the machine became, the pan became smart. She has a, but in fact the pan is not smart because she is connected with the system in the internet, so the recipes we cook Italian, and the cloud drops the recipe and the machine starts, and my wife is, please give me more celery, please give me all of that. And if the machine stops, which happens often, I have to read the recipe from the cell phone, and we forgot completely the first original book that comes with the pan. In a way, I think that what I vision today, and you more or less hinted with your digression in history, is that all times are at the same time now. And what I think, I thought also that the question about universities is important because universities became the only place where you can discuss this at the highest level. There are no other places left in society. And so this is the place where I think we should discuss the disappearance of history as part of curriculums. So you will not be able to deal with the future if you don't establish nexus of causality. And so in the end, it was really, really, really inspiring. And I'm looking forward to hear more. Can I write you with some of these questions?
Yeah, of course. And I just want to come back to the reason I picked something like Kandinsky or John Chris Jones and others is, of course, that there's, of course, much more to it. It's an enormously, I mean, that book by Kandinsky is fantastic. And these other works, and the reason I wanted to point to them is that I think that is what it takes to sort of really ask the core questions and don't stop until you sort of cut down to it. And I mean, it's just that the condition and the context of each time requires designers to do different kinds of inquiries into their practice to find these things out. And I think our set of inquiries, our questions are different from the ones of Kandinsky and Klee and others. We have a different set of issues. But we wouldn't be asking the questions the way we do if they had done what they did before us. So I agree. I mean, a reason why I wanted to have a historical reflection here is that there are certain things that makes a lot more sense when you see them in a bigger picture. And as I said, I may or may not be right about, that complexity is a driver for change in design, and it's sort of this known-unknown balance that's really shifting. But I think you do get to see something when you look at history like that, not as a line of people and products, but rather as a change in worldview and the way you think about what are the possibilities open for design to act upon.
I just want to react on this example with the cooking because I like it so much. No, it's great because what you say is your wife serves the machine while the machine is cooking. And it's not like it was before, that the machine serves her and she uses the machine while she is cooking.
And she needs you to serve her to serve the machine.
Yes,
Yes,
and
again.
I'm more and more involved in cooking.
And I think this happens.
A
This
few
happens
years
very
ago, I
often.
will fetch some onions and stuff like that.
It's a good thing.
Very slave work. Now I can look at her cell phone, not mine, and read the recipe because everything. No, it's
Yep.
the example.
But the point is that things are getting much more comfortable. But this comfortability is the cage. We put ourselves freely in cages and we just give the hand to the machines and say, okay, do you the thinking, this is so complicated and it's so much work. If you do the thinking, I'm fine with that. I just lay back and I'm happy.
And I think this is another reason why I want to call the way we think to the foreground, because that's an area where we come to think that's hard work. I mean, it is really difficult and hard work to think deeply about something. That's why we so rarely do it. But I do think that's something we need to pick up.
May I try to sum it? It's like you were saying that we shouldn't disguise the objects as being in the Euclidean world because they are not. They are in another world that exists more or less parallel to the Euclidean world. And another thing that I would ask you, the description that you made, designers study to be witch doctors, then prophets, then scientists, then I would say anthropologists because of co-design. And what's next? What's next? Revolutionaries? Why not? Out of the, because all this is a problem not of the digital, it's a problem of communication because digital facilitates the communication. The intelligence on that truck is not inside the truck. A part of it is outside the truck. In somewhere, as you said, that you don't even know where it is. So
We have work to do. Okay, but thank you so much.
Thank you.